Hey book nerds, welcome to my channel. So today, as promised, I am doing my mid-month wrap-up. I've decided to split up my wrap-ups this way because they always end up being my longest videos. They're a pain to edit and to upload in particular, and it just makes more sense so I can talk about books in as much detail as I want without feeling like I'm gonna make a video that's like an hour long. So in May, so far, I have read 9 books. 3 of them I've already talked about as part of the Half-a-Ween-athon, which was a readathon I did right at the start of the month. I will link that video down below. Most of these books also have blog posts attached to them where I talk about them in detail, so I'll link all of my blog posts down below if you want any more information. I'm going to do all my ratings and my general things in my end of the month wrap up, so let's start talking about the books. So the first book I actually read in April, but I read it on the last day of April, and so it did not make it into my April wrap-up, and that is Sinner's Retreat by Victoria Ellis. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. I loved this book. I talked about it in my most anticipated releases of this year. The author actually sought me out and sent me a free copy and asked me if I would consider reading it, which I did because it was described as "and then there were none meets Saw," which are 2 of my favourite things. I'm very pleased that I liked this book. I was concerned because the author sought me out, and that's never happened to me before. And while I'm more than happy to do salty, scathing reviews, I didn't want to be that person. And thankfully I did genuinely love this book. So this is a really, really short book. It's on Kindle Unlimited, so I highly recommend it. I think it's super cheap anyway on Amazon if you're not on Kindle Unlimited, but if you are, there's no excuse not to try this. It's basically about these 5 couples get sent invitations to this weekend retreat. When they arrive at the retreat, they become trapped there, and there's like a recording of a voice, and it tells them that they've all committed one of the deadly sins, and so they're gonna have to face choices at each designated mealtime where one of them will have to kill either the selected person or themselves. This was a really fantastic book. I read it in a couple of hours. It's great for binge reading because it is so short, and the writing style is it's very easy to consume, if that makes sense. That's not quite the right phrasing. It's definitely more of a thriller than a horror, I will say. There's not much of the Saw elements in there. It's more, there is violence in it, but it's not explicit, and it's not kind of what you'd expect from a horror book. But for a really good thriller, I definitely recommend this. There were some slight issues I had with it, but on the whole, really enjoyed it. It's definitely worth checking out. The next book I read was Paperweight by Meg Haston. This I read as part of Mentalhealthathon, which is going on now. I will link the Twitter in case you don't know about it. All the information's there. This is a book about a girl with an eating disorder, and she gets sent to a rehab clinic to try and cure her eating disorder. However, she has plans of her own, and she is planning to kill herself on the anniversary of her brother's death. This was a really tough read. It's a contemporary, as you can tell. It's one of those that is difficult, and certainly will be very difficult for some people to read, but I thought it was done so well. The characters are really realistic. It dealt with all the issues that it dealt with very sensitively and very intelligently, which is fantastic. It's nothing groundbreaking in terms of plot, but a book like this doesn't need to be. You kind of know what you're getting into when you read it. It's just a case of how well that story is told, and in this case I think it was told fantastically. Yeah, there's a lot of trigger warning for obviously eating disorder, mental health stuff, depression, and self-harm as well, but I think that is all of the trigger warnings for it. Yeah, it's a really good mental health read. It was perfect for Mentalhealthathon, and I'm very glad I decided to pick it up. The next book was a non-fiction book, and that was Exploiting Fandom by Mel Stanfill. This I kind of requested as a whim from NetGalley. It was an ARC, and I kind of read it I was approved super quickly and I read it super quickly as well. So this is about essentially how corporations and industries are exploiting fans for their benefit and using kind of fandom as a way of promoting their own properties and making money. So it looks at kind of, it splits up into sports and also into speculative fiction is what they classify it as. This was really interesting. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, and I realised that the actual topic wasn't for me, but parts of this book I found super interesting. So the first 2 chapters are about kind of the demographics of fans, and more importantly how companies see the demographics compared to how they actually are. So there was a whole bunch about how racism is prevalent in some aspects and like white privilege. There's a whole bit about feminism and gender privilege and how basically the white male fan is the stereotype according to the industries, but that isn't actually the case, and how that impacts advertising and many other aspects of those industries. That part was fantastic. I really loved that part. It was super interesting. It made lots of intelligent arguments I really liked. I will say the introduction of this, I wouldn't skip it, but essentially you can tell this is a book that is adapted from someone's dissertation or research paper. It's not a popular culture book. So the introduction is just the entire methodology, and that's very important, and it's important that they included it, but it's not particularly great reading. And I say that as someone who is interested in research and is going to do research as their career. Like, that's just how it felt. So the book as a whole is written like that. It's not written for the general public so much, although it is very easy to understand and I could follow it, having no academic experience in either of the fields that it talks about. Anyway, slight tangent. So the first 2 chapters were great. The middle bit had a section about the law, which was, to be honest, I skipped this bit because it kind of talked about the fans' perception of the law, which was interesting, but then it didn't compare it to how the law actually is. So it was a lot of fans think this and fans think that, and it mentioned like the disclaimers you put on fan fiction and stuff, but it didn't really talk about the industry, at least not in the first 20 or so pages that I read of that chapter, and then I just skipped it because it was too bogged down with legal jargon and stuff that I wasn't really enjoying. The final bit is the actual exploitation part. It was good. I didn't find it as interesting as the first few chapters, but that was my fault. That's what the book is about, and I just thought I would be more interested in that than I was. So I did give it 4 out of 5 stars because while it wasn't to my tastes, I think it did a great job of what it was intending to do. The next book was another non-fiction arc, and that was The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the film that terrified a rattled nation, a cultural history by Joseph Lanza. This I sadly gave 3 out of 5 stars, which I think is the lowest I'll ever give a non-fiction book. I think the video before this will be my horror rate books, which go watch that if you're more interested in what I'm talking about there. This book is supposed to be a cultural history of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So that's a horror film. It is not a horror film I've seen because I don't enjoy watching that type of film, but I am specifically very interested in horror and how that relates to culture and like historical contexts and all of that stuff. So I requested this arc because of that really strong interest, and I do know the plot of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre quite well, and that wasn't why I didn't enjoy the book, basically. The main problem with this is it doesn't have any of the connections between the history and the film, so it was structured very weirdly. The chapter titles are quotes from the film, but then there's no subtitle explaining what the chapter's actually about, which I think would have been really beneficial. And then it kind of does like an info dump of history, and then it talks about the film, but it doesn't link the two at all. So it's like, here's the political climate, and now let's talk about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And what I really wanted was how that was reflected in the film. For me, that's what the book should have been doing. Like, it talked about serial killers of the time, but it didn't talk about how they related to the actual killings of the movie. And it was just very frustrating. I ended up skimming a lot of it, because it just wasn't doing what I wanted it to do, and it wasn't engaging at all. And yeah, it's a shame, because I think this book could have been really great. It was just poorly written in terms of structure and those connections. So yeah, it was quite a disappointment. The next book was also a disappointment. It's not been a good month so far. And that is The Rest of Us Just Live Here by Patrick Ness. I also read this as part of Mentalhealthathon, and sadly I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. I just could not gel with the writing style of this book at all. This is the first Patrick Ness book I've ever read, and it was the book that I put on my list for... There were 10 authors that I really wanted to read in 2019, and Patrick Ness is one of them, and this is the book that I chose for Patrick Ness. And it's a book about a world where people have superpowers, and our main character is someone without superpowers who's just kind of trying to live in this world. And he's got OCD, his sister has, I think it was an eating disorder, and his mum is a famous politician who's running a campaign and has no time for either of her children. And there's sort of stuff about sexuality as well. It's basically more of a contemporary story, and there's stuff going on in the background, but that's not really what this book is like at all. I didn't like the writing style in general, but it also makes really weird choices narratively, and I don't know if I just don't get them. But so the superhero kids are called the indie kids by everyone who's not a superhero, and they're basically described as indie people, like so they've got like check shirts and they've all got weird names, and they're off having supernatural adventures and stuff. And it felt like it was making a joke that just didn't land. I didn't understand why it was mocking indie people and relating that to superheroes, because that's just not a trope I see. I had never read, and I consumed a lot of superhero fiction, and I've never read even like vampire stories. It's never indie kids who are the main characters. It's usually, if it's any stereotype, it would have been like goths or I guess nerds. I don't know, I just don't understand what the indie kid stuff was, and it really threw me and it confused me, and it felt like it was a joke that kept falling flat, because it's quite important to the story, it keeps being brought up. So that was a big problem. The other thing was that it has this little stuff at the start of the chapter, so it'll be like chapter 1 in which blah 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 blah, and that little section is about like the superhero story that's going on in the background, but it never interacted with the main story at all, apart from I think at one point near the end. And like, I get that was there, I understand the reasons why that was there narratively, but for me it still sounded more interesting than the story that was actually going on. I will say the book did handle the mental health stuff really well. That was a really strong aspect, and I guess if you don't mind the writing style, it would be a really good contemporary. But yeah, I was really disappointed by this book. I didn't understand what it was trying to do at all, and it feels like there was a lot of ways to execute what it was trying to execute that would have made more sense. So yeah, a disappointing read. And the final book I'm going to talk about is Skin by Liam Brown. This is a sci-fi book. Again, it's an ARC. I requested it on NetGalley, mostly because of this gorgeous cover, which I think is really cool. And this is set in a world where people have become allergic to other people. So everyone now lives in isolation within like their own little separate room, and they're not allowed to go outside. Sometimes they go outside, but they have a hazmat suit. But in general, people aren't allowed to go outside. And it's about this woman who is the mother of this family, and she's now living in a house with her family, and she has no interaction with them apart from through a computer screen. It's been a couple of years since people became allergic to each other, and it's kind of about where their lives are now, how her kids are growing up without her. This I gave 3 out of 5 stars to. I really, really enjoyed this book, particularly the characters. The characterization in this was fantastic. The main character, Angela was her name, she was just the perfect, like, perfectly written as a woman. Like, she was so realistic. She's basically someone who's like completely jaded and cynical, but also gets on with stuff. And I'm not trying to say that all women are like that or anything, but I meant, like, I've known people like her. I believe her as a person, and that was a really strong aspect. Other characters were similarly really well written. Plot-wise, it falls a little thin. It was good for most of it, and then the ending is particularly weak in my point of view, so that's why it wasn't a 4-star read for me. But the writing is really good. I really like how it explores the concept. It's definitely my kind of sci-fi where it'll take a concept and use that to explore human behaviour and characters and stuff. And it was just really enjoyable. It was really great. I would recommend it if you think the premise sounds interesting. And yeah, so that's all the books I'm going to talk about so far. I'll do another wrap up at the end of the month where I talk about the rest of the books that I've read. Hopefully my overall scores will be higher than they are currently, because it has not been a good month. But I've got a couple of reads I'm reading at the moment that I really am enjoying, and yeah, hopefully it'll get better. So thank you so much for watching. Do let me know if you prefer my wrap-ups done this way, because I think I do. If you did like this video, please give me a thumbs up, it helps me out massively. And I hope to see you next time.